It's an Archaeodeath interview with Lizzy Hathaway-White.
Archaeodeathlings, it's Professor of Archaeology Howard Williams here again with another special guest for an Archaeodeath interview. And it's Lizzy. Lizzy, please introduce yourself to our listeners and watchers and viewers and anyone that's maybe using other senses to tune in.
Hello, I'm Lizzy Hathaway-White. I'm an ex-funeral director and a community historian focusing on death and memorialisation in the city of Gloucester.
Well, this is wonderful. That's the whole interview. Goodbye. No, seriously, that's fantastic. And this is why I wanted to talk to you, Lizzy, because I had one of the best days of my professional life of going to talk to audiences, being invited down to Gloucester Cathedral recently and talking to the audience there in that wonderful august architectural and sacred site, but talking about these themes and hearing about your ongoing work. And I thought I really wanted to follow this up for an internet audience to get a sense of, the kind of work you're doing in Gloucester and the broader implications of it. But I suppose we could start off with, obviously death is one of your things, but I mean, how did you get into death, so to speak? I mean, how did the funeral directing come about, and then what happened next? Or maybe there's a longer story. And the age of 3, I remember quite distinctly. No, I don't know, but tell us your story.
It does. It's age 6. So I was raised by my grandma, and she unfortunately passed away when I was 6 years old, and obviously that was quite a difficult time. But the gentlemen, the funeral directors that came to come and collect her body, let me take part in kind of laying and placing her hands and closing her eyes, and kind of gave me an opportunity to say goodbye. And in this whole terrible process of losing a mother figure to cancer and this long protracted process, it was the first time probably in my life at 6 years old that someone had respected me and spoke to me like an adult and allowed me to be part of that process. I grew up in quite an old school kind of a way where it was children should be seen and not heard. And for me, that experience of being part of that process and them answering my questions and talking to me like an adult almost, really is what piqued my morbid curiosity, as it were.
So mortuary ball rolling, one could almost say.
Absolutely.
Obviously, I'm very sorry for your loss at such a young age, and circumstances not to be made lightly, but still, it did sort of set the inspiration for where your interest in death of come to fruition.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was always a morbidly kind of curious kid from that point on. And even to the point that I, very typically idolized the Nicole Richie version of Wednesday Addams, sort of teaching myself to sleep with my arms crossed and so on. And I still sleep like that now. I can't not sleep like that. But kind of later becoming a goth kind of child and teenager, I went on to study historical costume and ended up working for the National Trust and was made redundant during the pandemic. So I ended up without a job and had lost that, because I lived on site, the home that I lived in.
Double blow.
I know, but what an opportunity, because it gave me permission almost, where I'd kind of developed this career in heritage and so on, to sort of go, do you know what? It's a global pandemic. There's no community engagement or events or, visitor operations jobs going. What can I do that would be useful? And I was like, I'm going to go be a funeral director. So that was my kind of opportunity to fulfill that kind of childhood ambition. I tried to do funeral directing as work experience when I was 16 with the firm that had looked after my grandma, and they were like, no, come back to us when you're 18. But you go to university, you do historical costume apparently. And and so I got to experience the pandemic firsthand, which is probably not how most people would have wanted to experience the pandemic. It was scary enough as it was without sort of being in full hazmat, but it was just the most life-altering, life-affirming experience, really, to get to be part of what felt like history, and to be on the front line, but also to understand better this process of the care of the deceased that I had, looked to with such gratitude as a child. So yeah, I was a funeral director for 13 months through the pandemic, and then went back into the heritage field. But it's opened the door for me in terms of wanting to enable other people to have their questions answered. Everyone has always got a question when you say, oh, I used to be a funeral director, considering that so many British people are almost afraid of speaking about death because it's taboo and they feel like speaking about death makes it happen in some way. But as soon as someone hears you've been a funeral director, they go, is it true? Does this happen? Does that happen? Or they have their own personal anecdote. So that's been interesting. And I've combined my love of heritage and my love of the morbid arts, as it were, to pursue a project in Gloucester with Voices Gloucester, a charity who funded my research, which is called Death and Memorialisation, 2,000 years of death and memorialisation in the city of Gloucester. So,
well, I'd love to come on to that, but before I do, can I just sort of circle back to your phrasing, because I want visitors to think about I want viewers to think about this issue. You said you were on the front line during the pandemic, because a lot of people I think of the front line in terms of emergency services, but the pressure, the responsibility, the engagement with those who have those who have passed on. Who would have, not necessarily because of COVID-19, but because of the circumstances of the restrictions, made it all the more difficult to deal with this difficult time. And people in your position were mediating the extra regulations around funerals and public gatherings, as well as the extra death toll from the pandemic. And so I think Frontline said it all, but I just wondered whether you this is a part of a broader conversation, or that's the way you have perceived it. Because I think that absolutely chimes with me from what I understand.
I mean, during the pandemic, my colleagues, we called ourselves the Fifth Emergency Services. And there were obviously nurses and doctors who were frontline with patients, but we didn't know to what effect a dead body could pass on COVID-19.
No.
And because of the rollout of the vaccines, we were working basically unvaccinated, because we were further down the list than those doctors and nurses that were frontline. I got vaccinated earlier than kind of my elderly parents, but
yes, but yeah,
we were in full hazmat suits, so the N95 masks plus respirators, if you full hazmat, white suit and face guards, and just so warm, and going into nursing homes. And it really was like the end of days. It was, red crosses on doors, and it was an incredible and terrifying experience, because you didn't know if you were going to catch something and what that might do to you. So that was difficult. And then so that was Frontline kind of bringing people into our care, but we then weren't allowed to wash their hair or remove their jewelry, or do all of that kind of care of the deceased. That for me was the most enjoyable part of the job. It's it doesn't matter if no one's coming in to visit this person or see this person. We had a duty of care to look after them and send them off at their best. And for me, it was that kind of thankless last kindness for a stranger that really was the important part of the role to me. Organising funerals and talking with families, yes, but actually that time with the deceased, and making sure that their hair is permed as per they liked to wear it, or making sure that their nail varnish wasn't chipped, or those small details that's so human, but no one really thinks about the fact that they get done, and it's just you and a little old lady for an hour and a half,
Yes.
getting her ready.
And circling back even further, just before we talk about your current project again, I wondered whether you would be willing to talk a little bit about how, before you worked for the National Trust, what degree you did, because you don't have you're dealing with archaeology now, but you didn't do a degree in archaeology, if I recall.
No. So my degree is in costume interpretation
Yeah.
from Wimbledon School of Art, which has become University of the Arts London. So
Okay.
my interest had been in historical costume, specifically in the mid 1700s.
Okay.
So you're looking at kind of big pannier dresses and lots of foof and flounce and big wigs. And so I went to study at Wimbledon. My family were a family of reenactors, so I'd always grown up kind of doing dressing up, as it were. But the kind of costume construction was really interesting to me, and so that's what I studied at university. And I specialised in kind of handmade corsets from the 18th century, as you do. But it's going to surprise you, Howard, not that many jobs. Being an 18th century mantua maker, weirdly.
Who knew? But
Weirdly,
a fantastic subject. And to be honest, it's living history, it's fashion history, art history, it's all types of ways of engaging with past people, their lives, their stories, their costume, their material culture. And it's archaeology. I claim it as archaeology. In many ways, I think you have an archaeology degree and don't know it. That's what I'm going to claim. And you can
I'll take
I don't know
it.
if that's an insult or not, but
No, I'll take it. But it's that kind of social history
yes,
that all ties together. So, I mean, it might seem weird to be like, oh, costume degree, background of career in heritage, funeral director, and that, but it does all tie together. I'm just interested in the humanity of people, and I think that they're probably best displayed between, memorialization practices, burial practices, and also the clothes that we wore. And within that, I prefer kind of working class and middle class kind of clothing trends and so on, and burial trends.
Rather this obsession with the toffs all the time, which takes up most of our books and most of our heritage sites. Yes,
I know, but I'd much rather sort of something a bit more down to earth. And there's the Foundling Museum hold the most wonderful collection of 18th century working class women's fabrics, because they left the fabric with their children when they gave them up for adoption. And I was really fortunate to be a researcher on a project for that when I was studying. So yeah, just that hands-on history.
I think that discussion, I know there's lots we could delve into here about your backstory, but I think that at least captures something of why you're such a fascinating and interesting person, and with so many experiences that then applies to your current role and your current project. So let's get back to where you were going. Your current role at Gloucester Cathedral and in Gloucester, sorry, more broadly, because it's not just about the cathedral, and your current project, which is hardcore archaeology as far as I'm concerned, in a way, or at least the public archaeology of death, which is one of the things I like.
So as you've touched on, yes, I am a Voices Gloucester community producer for this funded project, so 2000 Years of Death and Memorialisation. I also happen to be the Community Engagement and Participation Officer at Gloucester Cathedral, which is very exciting. So all my worlds kind of met when Voices Gloucester had hired the cathedral to put on a day about talks about death and archaeology for the Festival of Archaeology. And then I got asked to speak, which I promise wasn't nepotism. It was very, very exciting to sort of everything. I had many hats on that day.
Yes, I didn't quite understand all the hats, and I still don't quite get my head around the labels. But basically what you've got is your role is at the cathedral, but you were commissioned by Voices Gloucester, who are what are they called, a charity organisation, or were they?
They are a charity. Yeah, they're a charity that specialise in the telling of working class and migrant histories in the city of Gloucester, and almost as a direct response to so many people telling the history of white rich men in the city of Gloucester. So Voices have been around for 3 years and have been funded by Historic England, Arts Council England, and supported by Gust as well. So they've just received charity status last month, which is really exciting.
Oh, that's good. So that's since I was down there. Brilliant.
Yes,
So
yes,
things are
yes.
moving forward, and so tell us about what you're doing with these 2,000 years of death in Gloucester. What are you up to?
So I feel like there are a number of stories that can be told through, death and memorialization. And you can pick up a story of one person and a richly lived or interesting life or death, as it were. But for me, I feel that as a city, Gloucester has always welcomed, sometimes not so welcoming, accepted, adapted, changed religious practices, religious beliefs, memorial practices over this 2,000-year period from the Iron Age to the arrival of the Romans and the founding of Gledon as a city. But ultimately, we are a city shaped by migration.
Absolutely.
And I think I thought, and I've been funded to look into the kind of history of migration represented through memorialization. So for me, that's starting at the Iron Age with the fantastic burial of the bird-lipped woman, which includes, if I do say myself, and I am biased, the most exquisite Iron Age mirror burial to have been found in the UK. And we're really, really fortunate that we still hold all of the burial finds that exist in the local museum, in the Museum of Gloucester. So anyone can go into the Museum of Gloucester and see these finds for free. There's a certain large museum in London that keeps suggesting that they're going to come and take them away. But we've managed to hang on to them.
Don't let them in.
I know, bar the doors. Yes, and then working through the Roman era, of which we have 5 Roman cemeteries around the city, and just some really incredible discoveries. So we're pretty sure that we have one of the only kind of white quartz pebble burials, so that the pebbles on the eyes in the city. Some really interesting cremation urns. So there's an example from the Kingsholm Roman Cemetery of cremains with gambling tokens mixed in, which is lovely, in a lovely kind of faced cremation urn. So basically looking at the archaeological record, looking at what is held at our museum, what has been discovered in the city, bringing those stories together, looking at how memorialization practices have changed over time, and then more recently looking at how we have welcomed our kind of more modern migrant communities. So speaking and working with our Windrush generation and our Afro-Caribbean communities, working with our Muslim communities. So our first mosque was built here in Gloucester in 1958, and speaking with them not only about the practices that they have now, but what it was like for them coming into a new city, a new country with a different religion and very different burial practices and traditions, from us, and what that was like to say, well, actually, no, I need to bury my dad within 24 hours, and actually, no, it needs to be done this way. So all of this project is aiming towards, in 2025, a feature-length documentary, as well as a community exhibition. So the archaeological record and the historical stuff, for want of a better expression, and then working with communities to tell stories and represent their traditions through a community exhibition, which will be held at the Museum of Gloucester, and the launch of the documentary that will tell the whole story, which will be launched at the Guildhall in Gloucester in July 2025. So
fantastic. So a long time, but not much time at another level, is it? Because that's coming around fast at one level. But I love the idea of taking that longue durée view of one city, or its fortunes and its status as a settlement obviously shift over time through the early Middle Ages, the Roman early Middle Ages, well, Iron Age before, of course, but Roman Middle Ages and modern era. But death binds us, and while of course the experience of people moving, in the modern era is going to be very different. It sparks those connections between, being uprooted, and people always think about migrant communities, oh, it's about the living, but it's also about how you deal with loss and that disconnect from your homelands, and how you make new meanings, new connections to place for yourself in life, but also for your loved ones in death. It's really profound issues there that cut to the center of who we are and who we've been, over the centuries. I think it's wonderful.
You sort of think how exhausting it must have been to constantly have to kind of vocalize your needs and fight for what you need, in a second, third, fourth, fifth language, in a place that you're not that familiar with, so being able to capture those stories, but kind of more historically in the more recent past, but also being able to capture those stories and traditions now. So we have a wonderfully diverse community in the city of Gloucester, and not only will I be working with our Afro-Caribbean and our Muslim communities, but also our Romanian and Latvian communities who have some really specific cultural traditions within kind of more orthodox faiths, and also working with a local, actually another Voices Gloucester community producer, Kelly, who has been doing work to talk about the Gypsy community in Gloucester, which is a really, really historical town for Gypsies to come. And that, I have to say, that is the word that Kelly has asked that we use. So a really rich history of Gypsy people not only meeting and travelling for the horse drive in the city of Gloucester, but also settlements, kind of winter settlements around the city. And Kelly and I have been talking about the burning of Vardos. So when a member of the community dies, their Vardo, or as you or I might call it, caravan, is burnt with their belongings inside. And it's a tradition that is unfortunately kind of disappearing, but some of the most recent Vardo burnings have been in Gloucester. So I'm really excited to kind of capture these stories that otherwise you just might not, you'd never know, because you don't exist in that community and it's not our kind of day-to-day norm. So why would we know, but to show us as a whole, Well,
as you know, one of my particular themes of interest in long-term human experience of death is the utilization of fire to transform the dead, to destroy or break down objects, but also as memorable spectacles in themselves. And the Gypsy community's use of fire is just one of many where we can trace back in Gloucester to the Roman period, and overlapping and representations of fire. The cathedral's full of representations of neoclassical vases, which are evocations of the cremated dead in a culture that wasn't cremating the dead.
Exactly.
But they're memorializing through euphemism, through visual euphemism, metaphors, that sense of ashes before we have a modern funerary cremation process. So there's so many ways in which fire and death connect, and that's really fascinating. And I suppose in this, the archaeology, the museum collections, the landscape is a resource to allow you to reflect on the shared themes. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what has been really helpful during this research period, where I am looking at the archaeological record and accessing collections, is that in pretty much every era that we look at in the city's history, be that kind of Iron Age or Roman, medieval, that Saxon, there are a wealth of very different traditions being practiced. So we have the birdlet woman, and she's in a barrow and she's got really rich grave goods, but we've just discovered a burial in a banjo enclosure that dates to a really similar period with no grave goods of a young man. In terms of our Roman kind of burials, we've got I think the only Roman plague pit to have been found in the UK. We have, chicken burials with people, and the interesting cremations and the pebbles. We've got a lacrimosa burial, which is a little vase for crying tears in. In the Anglo-Saxon, we've got charcoal lined graves.
Oh yes.
So what's really interesting is that in any of those kind of major periods that you pick from the city's history, we at no point can we say everyone was doing X, because we've got really clear and multiple examples of, but they were also doing Y, and sometimes they did Z, and those are just the ones that we found, and I think that is a wonderful reflection of, not necessarily a majority religion, or not necessarily a majority in tradition, or the way that we look after our dead. And if you think about in your own personal experience, or if I think about my own personal experience, my father's side of the family has a tradition of always going to visit their deceased, no matter how long they haven't spoken for or talked, or been in contact for, but we will always go and travel to see someone, and we always take a lock of hair. That's my father's tradition, white British tradition. My mum's white British tradition is we always take something to leave in the coffin, no matter what it is. Something that is precious to you, that you're kind of, for want of a better expression, sacrificing, you're kind of giving, to go in the coffin for that person forever. And so white British, culturally Christian upbringings on both sides, but quite different traditions in how they deal with their dead and their kind of grief. So it's kind of interesting to think, okay, well, Christianity came to Gloucester. It was basically the capital of Christianity of England at that time, but yet there's so many different ways that people are being buried and memorialized. Is that a cultural, a familial, a traditional thing? It's interesting.
And obviously with a project like this, you're just really scratching the surface. There's so much rich potential you can, for exploring those stories. But it's by picking on case studies and examples that really sort of get people who may have not dealt with archaeology before, or if they do, it's very much in a different format. It's about this is what happened in this period, and this is a different story. This is about the history of death. So this is not another what happened when, or this is not another or if it is about death, it's always about disease or medicine. This is about the funerary practices as the focal point of the treatment and care for the dead, that seems and the commemoration of those remains, which I think is really lacking in a lot of discussions. And I certainly still see us regress back to this model of seeing them as anatomical specimens to showcase particular diseases, or simply, oh, the Romans did this, here's some of their burials, as almost ancillary to life. It's actually putting death at the center, which I think is really important.
And yes, I agree. The interesting thing, and something we used to say at the funeral directors is, funerals aren't for the dead, they're for the living. So actually it gives you really an insight into how loved, how well respected that person was through the eyes of the people that cared most for them. So the lacrimosa burial, the thought that the last thing, everyone stood around and shed a tear into this vial and placed it in her hand before, it's so human. And death is the great kind of equalizer, isn't it? But also that experience of loss, that experience of grief is part of that great equalizer. So and I can't help, and you'll attest to this, at points when we were talking with each other and at the Grave Matters Day at the cathedral, I surprised myself by getting emotional, because you're sharing with this room full of people, the story of a teenage girl whose parents, placed this vial in her hands, or her loved ones placed this vial in her hands, or the young boy with rickets and that's been found, and yes, it's how old were they, and are they male or female, and what did they die of? But actually it's how were they loved, how were they respected, how did their loved ones want for them to be remembered? And it's just so human. It's brilliant. It's delicious. I love it.
It's delicious because it sparks a connection between the living, and we can talk about things we don't normally talk about through the medium of the long dead, the distant dead, be it decades or centuries or
Gives
millennia.
permission.
And I think we have that. I think that's really important, and it makes me ask the next question for you. Really, building on this project is what do you think? I mean, we've obviously come a long way in recent decades. We're trying to use, the medical specimens, archaeological collections, and historical discussions to sort of create a death positive movement that, helps to facilitate not simply conversations but dialogues with the dead in corporeal and material terms. So I'm talking in academic speak, but I'm trying to capture. I've just been accused on social media. Oh, he talks a bit posh, or don't mention. I'm trying to. It's important that we try and capture the sense. It's not just about, oh, let's have a chat about death. It's about making sure that the material and the corporeal are part of those conversations. I feel we've come a long way, but do you feel we're doing enough? I mean, what do you feel? So what I was trying to get at, and I don't know how you'll answer this, is what are the key challenges for getting the public to engage with our mortality? I mean, should we be doing this? Should we just let people not think about it until it's, what's at stake here? Why should we do it? And what do you think of the challenges? That's a two-part question. I should start again.
I know what you're getting at. So I mean, I think I love that you talked about death positivity, and that's one of the things that I usually say. I'm death positive. I'm a member of the Order of the Good Death. So which is all about opening up those conversations and being able to talk about death and dying, and what does a good death look like to you? How do you want to be remembered? So I think that there's a number of kind of spokes, if you will. First of all, it's giving permission to people to talk about death. And like I said right at the beginning, the moment you say to someone, oh, I'm a funeral director, or I used to be a funeral director, everyone's got a question or an anecdote. People have got this morbid curiosity that they feel like they're not allowed to talk about with their friends or their parents, or they don't even Google it. It might not be that, but the moment that they're faced with someone who's a quote unquote expert by experience, automatically everyone's got a question. And it's usually really gross, is what I'll say, but it's really natural. So giving people permission to ask those gross kind of weird questions. And you stayed at the day that we did Grave Matters. You did a talk and I kind of presented my project to you, and then in the afternoon I did a talk with my dear friend and a fellow Voices producer, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, Ash Mackenzie-White. And as part of that, we gave people the opportunity to ask us the weirdest, grossest questions that they could, because people need that space and they need permission to do that. So that's the first one. And it's a bit more hands-on because it doesn't feel hands-off, because it doesn't feel as personal. They're not thinking about dad or mum or, someone that they've lost when they ask these kind of weird questions, as it were. That's the first thing. The second thing is to be able to face down our own mortality. So anytime I do a talk, I hand out, kind of tongue-in-cheek, funeral plans. So I make you draw a picture of what you look like and put your name, and I am 36 and a half years old, and on the inside, I want to be circle one, buried, cremated, burnt like Viking style, which you legally can't do and it doesn't work, but that's a whole other conversation. But I want flowers, raise money for this charity, play this music, don't invite this person, hold my wake at here, and that comes from being a funeral director and talking to a gentleman. It would happen time and time again, and you'd say, does she want to be buried or cremated? And you go, I don't know. We never talked about it. They've been married for 60 years, and we've never talked about if we want to be buried or cremated. We have to have these conversations, not least because when we die, we leave behind people who are grieving, who can make really poor financial decisions based on what they think that you might want. So and things are better now. There's regulations that were introduced a couple of years ago in the UK, so that there has to be transparent pricing with funeral directors. But I think people tend to look at funeral directors kind of through the side eye because they think everyone's like a wheeler dealer and they're all trying to kind of make money off you and upsell you. And that's not my experience. But, you know, I worked for one organization in one part of the UK, and that might not be a universal experience. So to best equip the people that we love for when we inevitably die, you need to have conversations and be like, this is what I want.
I in many ways, I don't know if you'll agree with me. There's professional dealers with death you could see as everything from medical professionals through to funeral directors. But then archaeologists and heritage professionals are also, in a sense, kind of death dealers. We are negotiating stories of past mortality for people to reflect on today. So these heritage spaces, I think, have an important role in that regard.
And it's interesting because when you're looking from a heritage perspective, the term unconscious bias, you know, we know what unconscious bias means, but it also, in a way, applies to the way that we view the deceased of the past. So, for an example, in the cloisters of Gloucester Cathedral, there are people who are laid to rest in the middle of what essentially is a corridor. And you will see people visiting the cathedral and they'll clock what it is. Oh, it's a gravestone, and they'll stop and they'll try and tap around. And then it's sort of like a big game of hopscotch because there are so many people that are buried there that you couldn't possibly basically walk anywhere without treading on them. And frankly, even the very garden that people walk through to get to the entrance of the cathedral was the lay cemetery, and there's thousands of burials there, you know, layer upon layer upon layer. We just don't advertise it because it's been lovingly landscaped. But having the conversations with people that say these people asked to be buried here because they thought every time someone stepped on them, it would get them kind of, for want of a better expression, more points in heaven. That the more that people remembered them and looked at them and stepped on them, the quicker that they would kind of get to heaven, or longer that they would stay in heaven. So walk on them, it's fine, it's what they would have wanted. But we look through a lens of our own time where you go to a cemetery and don't walk on the graves, and you know, and that's not even considering the fact that we only started putting gravestones facing the deceased about 200 years ago, and any gravestone, you know, before that it was at the foot of the grave. So inevitably, if you're walking on a walkway, you are walking over dead bodies, you know. So I think it's we have to be careful that we don't look through this modern lens, or that we're translating for people to say, no, this is what it was like for them, or this is what they probably believed in, and this is probably what they wanted. But it does feel more, and I think this could be part of the problem, more sanitized. You know, when people sit through a talk about archaeology, they think that the person 2000 years ago in the, you know, cremation urn it's not them. But there's this like perception. Jump in if you think I'm wrong.
No, I'm listening. Yes,
there's this like perception, I think, from my limited experience compared to yours, that people will look at you know, remains from Roman or Iron Age, or, you know, earlier Bronze Age, what have you, and they think that those people were stupid, or not they kind of other them, you know. Yes. They're stupid, or they didn't understand, or they weren't from like a civilized society. Or I think generally the public, and I'm taking this from kind of questions that I've been asked or conversations that I've had with people, they perceive people of the past to be so long ago that they're not kind of real humans. They're not like us. I have to be like, no, they are. They thought exactly like we did, and they loved exactly like we do, and they had dreams and ambitions, and, you know, well, everyone was dead by the age of 30. No, they weren't. You know, plenty, same as it is really, you know. You might have died of dysentery, but we die of car crashes, so about the same kind of mortality rates, you know. And I think heritage can clinicalize kind of that humanity that I find really important. And in some instances, it's a good thing to challenge that. But also, I guess in some instances, it's if it's going to get people in and they start to change their mind or think of it differently or feel comfortable to ask a question, then that's okay too.
So we were going to talk about Ashley's project as well, because Gloucester seems to be a hub of death. So you've got your project, you've got the cathedral, which in itself is a monument to worship, but also to the various, there's royal tombs, there's the tombs of the great and the good, there's the broader landscape. But what about Ashley's project? How does that fit in?
Yeah, so it's quite funny really in that my project's Memento Mori, 2000 Years of Death and Memorialisation in the city of Gloucester. Hers that she popped in for, and we totally independently submitted funding bids to Voices Gloucester at the same time. Her project is Dismanibus, so to the what is it, like memories
Spirits of the departed,
spirits of the departed.
Yeah.
Yes, that's something similar. And her project focuses on the display of a human remains in the Museum of Gloucester.
Right.
So the remains are of a roughly 25-year-old woman, excuse me, who was found in a carved sarcophagus buried on a boundary line in what is thought to be a Roman bathhouse, probably previously was a private dwelling in an area of the city called the Hucklecote, and she's known as the Hucklecote woman. And there's not really much more known about her than what I've just told you. And for Ash, who actually had worked at the museum, walking past these remains of, an open coffin and the sarcophagus and the remains are laid out. She comes from New Zealand and has a very different cultural experience of death and the way that the deceased are cared for and respected and displayed, or as it were, not displayed out of respect. So her kind of New Zealand culture, she was just utterly shocked that we would have this poor woman on display at the museum and just sort of say, oh, well, she's 25 years old and this is where she was found and this is when she was buried, and that's it. Next human display, which there is another one, there's the Kingsholm Goth on display very, very close by. So Ash's project looks to bring back some of that humanity to the Hucklecote woman, and she's created a short, kind of more artistic approach, a short video where she has interviewed 25 women or 25 people who are roughly 25 years old to reflect on what they would want to ask the Hucklecote woman, or what her life might have been like, what they ponder about her. And the idea is that video will go on display in the museum to accompany this very small tag about the Hucklecote woman, so that people can kind of connect
exactly
with
because
her.
Sorry, but this is the problem with museums. There's a whole debate about repatriation and collections from around the world. But in terms of local remains, there's so much potential and so much missed opportunities in the traditional display of the dead, even if they're assembled and there's a mock-up funerary context. The small labels often just cannot encapsulate. And so I think the idea of a video which shows local people reflecting, I saw when I went down there, came down to Gloucester, that helps to get that personal reaction, her own, but also other people who've interacted with those remains, because she is like a local celebrity. All these skeletons in our museums are like local famous dead celebrities, aren't they? Whether they're mummies from ancient Egypt or they're Iron Age burials or Bronze Age burials, they have a place. And while she has not been brought from the other side of the world, she is of Gloucester, and people, generations of school kids have been to see her. And I think museums have such a potential here for storytelling, not only things we know from the archaeological excavation analysis, but we can be creative. I was just reading a paper just published by Professor Sarah Tarlow talking about the ethics of displaying the dead, and she's very much like me, not exactly the same as me, more of an advocate that yes, there are problems with these displays, but there's many positives to the display of the dead. And yes, from a Antipodean perspective, and respectful of indigenous cultures, this looks utterly horrific. And yes, there is a deep tradition of disrespect and freak show creation, but I think there's a lot of really positive things we can do with the dead in our museums that connect people to stories about history and mortality. So yeah, and that's the kind of way we can sort of amp it up by sort of creating new media ways of engaging. Sorry, I just think this is really exciting.
I mean, and what's interesting, and Ash would be a great guest for you, and Ash is an experience that everyone should get to experience, when we were doing our talk together. So a quick plug for anyone that's interested in death and memorialization and wants to see two women, one of whom believes in nothing, I'm an ardent humanist, and one whom believes in everything, that would be Ash, discussing these subjects, matters, and differences of opinion. We do have a podcast called Grave Matters that's just about to launch, so I can share that link with Howard, and maybe you could give us a quick plug.
Because it will all be in the description of this video.
Thank you. But being able to have these conversations with Ash, and for her coming at them not only from a different view within kind of my cultural context, but a different view within her cultural context. And one of the things that she talked about, because she had she works in heritage and worked in museums in New Zealand before she travelled here, but the way that the museums will display the dead so that they are conscious of different people's beliefs. So human remains, if they feel that they have to go on display for a reason, will be kind of fenced in a darkened space, so that you have to physically opt to go into that space and come out of that space, so that you have the opportunity to say, no, I don't need to see them, or yes, I do want to see them. Whereas part of the issue with the Hucklecoat Woman, the Birdlip Woman, the Kingsholm Goth, and I'm just using local references, but in all museums, is that these people, and they are people, are on display, that a lot of people think, oh, that's not real. That was the thing that you always get with the Hucklecoat Woman. Oh, that's not real, because it's so perfectly a skeleton. It looks like something you could buy as part of Halloween decor. She's just laid out in this really massive sarcophagus, and it's it doesn't look real because it looks too perfect to be real, but she is. People walk past and go, just a plastic skeleton in a coffin. It's not. No. So some way trying to get that humanity back, and maybe there's a middle ground there that says, yeah, we feel that these need to be on display because they tell a really important story, or could we do it a different way? Could they not be on display? I mean, I was always the kid, I know it's going to surprise you, that as soon as I went into a museum, I'd be looking to see if there was something weird or morbid or kind of human on display, and I'm still kind of like that now, really. It's kind of a thrill to see people on display, which I know is probably taboo to say, but it feels like you shouldn't be allowed to. It feels like you shouldn't be allowed to. And then sort of I was at Wookie Hole recently, and it's not the focus of their museum, but they're like, oh, and here's some human remains. It's just like, oh, that's mad. Like, to me, that should be the star of your show, but yeah, I don't know, it's hard.
So I suppose my final question, there's so many things we could be talking about here, but my final point for you is that sort of final thoughts or reflections of what do you feel are the things we could be doing better, or the things we should be doing more of in the future? Lizzy, what do you think, or what would you like to be doing with the dead, in the future, to take forward your passion to educate and engage in issues of mortality?
So what can we be doing on a personal level, as people in friendship groups? Let's have more conversations about death. And it's weird and it's awkward, but it literally would be like, so Howard, you're my friend, and I just want to let you know what my death plan is, just in case. So I'm now going to give you my death plan. So when I die, I don't want to be embalmed, and if I can help it, I don't want to go into a coffin. I'd quite like to go into a cotton shroud, and I'd like a natural burial, please. So just in a green burial ground. I don't mind where it is, but I would just like to be left to rot to the earth, and maybe a nice tree planting on top of me. And my current thoughts are, I'm not too sure about whether or not I'd want any kind of memorial marker. I like the idea of kind of humility and being humble and being forgotten to the ground. But also, I'm really into memento mori and gravestones. And I could, in theory, really want a really obnoxious kind of hourglasses and cherubs and dancing skeletons kind of a gravestone. So maybe I leave that up to my friends to decide. And that's all you need to say is that's what I want, you know? I've thought about it. That's what I want.
And it's part of you and your plans and sharing those knowledge. I mean, I've thought about it a lot, too much, but also never come to a real conclusion. But currently my flavour of the week is that I want to be burnt on the top of a hill on a pile of carrot cake.
I mean, you'd need a lot of carrot cake, and we could definitely go into a conversation at some point about why Viking ship cremations probably never happened.
Exactly.
But you know, open pyres, Colorado have not long what's like regulated.
Yes.
Allowed,
legalized. I don't know if it's not facilitated, you know, sanctioned.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sanctioned, open pyres. So that's very cool. So if you fancy it, you might have to plan to you know, pop your clogs elsewhere. But I think that's cool. Bring back open pyres. But you need a lot of wood. That's the problem.
I know, and a lot of cake.
Yeah, or a lot of cake, as it were.
I don't know why. I don't know if cake will burn. I'm just making rubbish up now. But
very. Well, I've seen your actual funeral plan that I made you do at my talk, and I know who's on the do not invite list. So
I put it on my blog so people can go and read that if they want to. But no.
But on a personal level, that's what we can do. We can start to have these kind of conversations. On a professional level, I think it's really important to stop and think. And as you said, you know, you've just read this new paper on kind of what best practice is, and best practice will continue to develop. And I think it would be really easy for us to say, right, that's it, no more human remains on display. And if we feel they need to be on display, we could get them 3D printed. And
yes, exactly.
You know, there's you know, we could take that kind of approach. Is there a middle ground? Probably. I think practice will continue to develop as we kind of grow as a society and our attitudes towards death change. What I don't want is for people to go, because it's taboo and we shouldn't have skeletons on display. You know, the biggest lie that has been told is that when someone dies, their dead body becomes dangerous and that they need to be embalmed, or, you know, while someone's still warm, you've got to call the funeral directors, the undertakers, and have them removed. And it's just not true. If you want to take the weekend to spend time with mum, you do that. And if you are worried, you call up a funeral director and you say, I want mum to stay in the house for the weekend. Can you come and help facilitate that? And we as professionals have ice blankets and all sorts of ways to make sure that we can facilitate that for you. So we need to get more comfortable with death, not less comfortable with death. And then the future, what does the future hold? What would I like? Well, I'm really excited and I'm really grateful that I've been able to research into the kind of historical and the archaeological kind of record. I'm really looking forward to the next phase of the project, which is people. And I'm kind of a people person. So the oral history and the sharing of stories, and this next phase is shaped by the communities that I'm working with. So although I have an idea of what I'd like that outcome to be, you know, it's going to be co-produced. So a year from now, it could look completely different to what we've just discussed. The documentary will be there to kind of capture the process, but maybe it won't be an exhibition. Maybe it'll be a stage production or something. I don't know. I'm going to be led by the community. So that's exciting. And then in terms of
Death,
me,
the musical.
Oh, well, yeah, possibly. Why not? In terms of me, I'm just really excited to be able to have more conversations like this, and to kind of share my learnings and my hobby. Death is my obsession in so many ways. And so I spend all my time kind of, I mean, you laughed at me before we started recording. You said, "What have I been up to?" Because I've just had some annual leave, and I said I've been haunting graveyards.
Yes.
Which as a goth kid, I mean, mid-30s kid, goth kid, that looks like going out with my camera and taking photos of really rare gravestones and memento mori inscriptions, or brass rubbing, visiting old churches and things. So I will continue to share those things on my Instagram, which is coffins and cupcakes _ so follow me if you like grave art and odd burials and things, and to keep up to date with my project. So that's it, really.
Thank you so much, Lizzy. It's been a pleasure, a privilege to not only meet you and Ashley and have that opportunity to be in Gloucester and to talk about death, but also to follow up so rapidly. I know you've been so busy over the summer with this conversation. It's really great, and I certainly need to come back down to Gloucester and
I'm going to show you some Bale tombs.
I mean, they are pretty cool, and to go around the museum, which I didn't have time for. I really want to do that, but for the moment, and for this this Archaeodeath interview, when there's so much more coming from this project alone, I'm excited to see how it happens. But for now, thank you so much, Lizzy.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate your support.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.